In 24-25, City blowing a lead should come as a surprise to absolutely no one. They've been leaking goals all season, but this was the first time we've seen Guardiola make significant tactical changes to try and stem the bleeding. And for long spells, it did work. The aim of the tactical shift was presumably to fix the one element they've been trying to deal with all season, the counter-attack. But these changes had fascinating ripple effects across City's entire tactical setup. All season, we've seen the Blues use a 3-4-3 diamond in possession, as Pep has looked to make up for defensive weakness through offensive prowess. But the problem with that shape going forward is it's left them with just 4 men at best in the rest defense when the ball is high up the pitch. These 4 men are the pivot and the 3 centre-backs. But the thing is, this shape would mean on the counter-attack, the single pivot would be easily overloaded, meaning the opponent would immediately be running at the back line. But that changed against Madrid. In a bid to fix this issue, Pep went back to a shape that we saw a lot of in perhaps his finest City side in 2017-2018. This was by building with just 2 centre-backs, Diaz and Ake, and having a single pivot being flanked by 2 inverted fullbacks as Akanji and Gvardiol tucked in, meaning that they had a 2-3 shape. And sure, having 3 centre-backs in front of the 2 centre-backs did provide more defensive steel, but more important than the personnel change was the change in the shape, as having 3 men here meant they had better coverage of the width of the pitch, theoretically making it harder to break through the first line of defence before they were running at the last line of defence. But the new rest defence shape wasn't just a defensive tweak, it transformed City's possession game entirely, as Pep primed City to try and take advantage of Madrid's defensive shape. In deep areas, Diaz and Ake would split either side of Edison, and as Mbappe and Vinicius operated as a front 2 in defense, there were occasions where they could get split. With Madrid in a 4-4-2, the risk of the midfield overload was always present, and John Stones would drop much deeper than Gvardiol and Akanji to exaggerate this advantage. This is because neither Mbappe nor Vinicius were great at cutting out the pass into Stones, meaning that when he received, either he would have the space to drive forwards, or if the Madrid pivots pushed higher to press him, the risk of Bernardo or De Bruyne being free between the lines became even bigger. But there was also a fascinating secondary effect that worked in 2 ways. Madrid's 4-4-2 defensive shape can become notoriously too narrow. This would only be made worse by the fact Bellingham and Rodrigo could be drawn further infield by the fullbacks who were inverting, so Madrid's shape was even narrower. City could exploit this to try and create space elsewhere. A fullback could drop even deeper and more centrally, essentially alongside Stones, and ask a question of the winger. Will you come all the way to apply pressure and make progression harder, or will you follow and leave even more room on the flanks? That brings us onto the biggest advantage of this shape for City. The new shape naturally meant they had a 5 versus 4 advantage against Madrid's backline, and more pertinently, a 2 versus 1 against Madrid's fullbacks due to the wingers being so narrow. This gave City options in the build-up, as the channels were now open for them to find the winger in the wider region as much as possible. And we have seen over the years just how devastating the combination of a winger in space and a run through the half space can be. So when the Madrid fullback was drawn wide, that's exactly what we saw, with City getting into good positions for the cutback, but often not making it count. But Madrid of course adapted, particularly in the mid-block. They sat slightly deeper, cutting off the passing lanes into City's midfield 3. But the wide 2 versus 1 still presented an issue. The winger, or more often the half-space man, could drop outside the narrow Madrid block to try and receive to be the progressor. But the real danger was when the fullback looked to follow the dropping man, as it left a huge space high up the pitch. And this is no more evident than in the opener. Rodrigo has been drawn infield by the fullback, giving De Bruyne space to drop into. Valverde follows, meaning space is created higher up the pitch. So the Madrid backline begins to shift across, Tchouaméni on the winger, and Haaland in a 1 versus 1 against his centre-back. Now both the centre-backs are wide, creating space for Gvardiol's late run, eventually leading to the goal. But Madrid were victors in the end, so what did they do? Well, their approach in possession was fascinating. City also defended in a 4-4-2, 2, with Haaland being joined by De Bruyne to press Madrid's centre-backs. From the first whistle, we saw just how dangerous this approach could be. Camavinga operated as the deepest pivot, and Bernardo Silva was given an incredibly aggressive pressing assignment. The 4-4-2 meant City were already at a numerical disadvantage, as Bellingham and Ceballos were free to operate higher up the pitch in advance of Camavinga, and the issue was already beginning to present itself. Bernardo would try to cover Camavinga, while leaving Stones isolated in a 2 versus 1 against Madrid's remaining midfielders. The theory was if they applied enough pressure, Madrid wouldn't be able to effectively play through this first phase in the midfield. But this was walking a tactical tightrope, because Ceballos could drop deep as a second pivot, creating an overload in the first phase, thus making it easier to find Bellingham, who was drifting freely ahead of him. And this disjointed City press left massive gaps in the midfield, gaps that Real threatened to take advantage of constantly. Los Blancos repeatedly exploited this through a simple but effective mechanism. One of their forwards would drop deep, dragging a City centre-back out of position and creating room for runners to explode into in behind. And when looking at this front three and this back four, Madrid were favourites in a foot race and threatened to take advantage consistently. But it was Madrid's second half tweaks that really turned the screw. They began manipulating City's midfield shape even more deliberately. Ceballos would drift into deeper positions on the left, forcing Bernardo to follow him. This created room for Mendy to either push high down the left flank or tuck inside, expanding the gaps between City's lines even further. Meanwhile, Bellingham's intelligent movement became increasingly influential. Rather than staying in a fixed position, he drifted across the pitch, picking up the ball in pockets of space and driving at City's defense. This fluid positioning made him almost impossible to track and created constant confusion in City's defensive assignments. And Madrid continually probed, but in the end it was City's own errors that undid them, allowing the Spaniards to mount another incredible comeback. Looking at the balance of play, Madrid were clinical in taking advantage of their opportunities, and it's a reminder that at the highest level, even the smallest tactical gambles can have devastating consequences. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to take your tactical knowledge even further, check out my newsletter through the link below. And if you want to go a step further, there is a link to sign up for a waitlist for a very exciting project I've been working on to help you master tactics.